The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show with me, Charles Christian, as once more we delve into the world of weirdness, urban myths, arcane history, geek culture, ghosts, magic, witchcraft, the occult, and anything else I think will intrigue you. We start with a housekeeping announcement, namely that at long last the Weird Tales video show playlist is finally up and running on our YouTube channel. We're adding new videos at a rate of about once a week on the theme of haunted landscapes, gothic spaces, and mythic places. The videos are all relatively short, and we'll gloss over the fact that some of the edits and drone footage is a little jumpy. Anyway, you can find them all on the Weird Tales Show channel on YouTube. Now, for an item that is not so much folklore with an L-O-R-E, but folklore L-A-W. It's a court report from the Southern District of Georgia. That's Georgia in the United States, not the country in the Caucasus. And it's about a plaintiff by the name of West, who brought a case alleging that employees of the Augusta Richmond County Public Library had used witchcraft to add friends to his or her Facebook account. By way of relief, the plaintiff asked the court to order the removal of all internet services from the library. And not altogether surprisingly, the court refused and dismissed the case as frivolous. On with the show, and time to introduce this week's guest. It's the American horror author, Kevin Lucia. Kevin is the ebook trade paperback editor at Cemetery Dance Publications. His short fiction has appeared in several anthologies, including one in the company of Neil Gaiman, Clive Barker, Bentley Little, and Peter Straub. He is the author of a number of short story collections, and his latest one, a Halloween-themed collection called October Nights, will be published by Crystal Lake in late October of this year. First off, congratulations on the book, which I have read from digital cover to digital cover. It's an excellent tale.
Oh,
what inspired you to write it? I mean, there's touches of the Stephen King and Ray Bradbury in there, sort of the Ray Bradbury "something wicked this way comes" type of feel, isn't there?
that's one of my favorite novels. And I teach it every year to my students, so it's definitely an influence. I mean, I've always loved October. I've always loved Halloween. Like you said, Something Wicked This Way Comes, The Halloween Tree, Dark Harvest by Norman Partridge. You know, these are all annual reads for me, and I love I've always loved Halloween. But as it happens, I've never had the opportunity. I've written one Halloween story before, but I've never had a Halloween release. I've never had a Halloween book. You know, so last spring, I touched base with my publisher, Crystal Lake, Joe Mahinhart at Crystal Lake, and I started, putting some stuff together. And I said, "Do you have room for a Halloween release? Because I've got these stories that I really want to write for Halloween." And he said, "Yes." So that's what last April, I just sat down and started putting them together. Spent the whole summer writing it, and that's where it came about. I just always wanted to write a Halloween centered book, and just decided by spring, let's do that.
Yeah, and we're obviously not going to give any spoilers, but basically it's a series of long short stories, almost novelettes,
Yes.
linked around the same location where weird stuff happens. What's the Is the location anything you are familiar with? Any place you've been? Any, your childhood or anything?
Yeah, so pretty much all of my work, all my other books too, take place in the same town. It's kind of an invented town up in the Adirondacks, which we vacationed there all the time as kids. And then we've done a lot of vacationing up there with my wife and I, and I just love the atmosphere up in the Adirondacks. It's very dense woods out there. And some of the places can be very remote, very cut off, and very picturesque up there. But it's also kind of like a sense of, I don't know, I'm probably being melodramatic, but whenever I'm up the Adirondacks, I feel this looming sense of like presence, when I first started writing these stories, I'm also a fan of Gary Bronbeck and his Cedar Hill stories, and of course Charles L. Grant and his Ox Run Station stories. So I'd always wanted to create my own little haunted town, and I felt like the Adirondacks is a place I know decently. I don't know it as intimately maybe as I'd like. I'd love to live up there, although I know the winters are pretty rough.
Yeah.
But I really felt like that would be a great place to create this little town of my own. So it doesn't actually exist. If it did exist, it would be to the east of like Old Forge, south of like Lake George. So
yeah,
that's the inspiration for that little town of mine.
Yeah. What do you think is the interest in these small town American tales? I mean, there's something quite unique about that style in horror, supernatural literature. It's not something we get in the UK. I mean, we get sort of old rural villages and things, a little bit sort of Wicker Manish, but we don't tend to. The small town America is something we don't really have.
So, as a person, as a small town person myself, so I grew up in the country and I grew up in a small town. On one hand, small town America is that, and there's the reality of it. There's the Americana picture of the small little town with the white picket fences.
Yeah.
First of all, there's the sense of community, which I'm not saying you can't have in a city. You certainly do have it in a city, but then there is a sense of familiarity. I sort of like walking into. My wife thinks I'm crazy because she prefers to go shopping at somewhere like Walmart or wherever where everything's cheaper. But I just love walking into. I love walking into like little country grocery stores where they know who you are, they know what you're going to buy ahead of time, and just the sense of living in a community and having community events. But I think what's also it's attractive for that, I think, because a lot of people who live in small towns, they find that to be comforting. They find that to be a sense of belonging. But what makes it such a great horror story is like everything else, is small town has its dark corners, it has its shadows, it has its secrets, and that sometimes can be overblown. I don't think every single small town in America has dark hidden secrets where people are actually really terrible and they're awful to each other. That sometimes can be overdone in the horror genre, where you have this. But that's not my vision of Clifton Heights. My vision of Clifton Heights is there's lots of darkness and there's lots of light there as well. It's not a totally, because that's been a little overdone in the horror genre, where you have the picture perfect town on the outside, but really they're all decadent, evil, and decrepit on the inside. I think it's more the idea that you have all the like for example, right now I'm rereading Salem's Lot by Stephen King, which is one of my favorite novels. And there's a great line in Salem's Lot where Matt Burke, the English teacher that Ben Mears hooks up with, it tells him that there's a lot of darkness here, but there's a lot of good people here too. And I think I think probably what fascinates me about that, and maybe what fascinates people about the horror genre, is being able to have that small town community that's friendly and reliable and familiar. But it's also just big enough that there are dark corners and there are sides to people that you don't know, and I think that provides a good vehicle for a horror story. And that's probably why, like you said, the small town American horror is really become a subgenre unto itself.
Yeah. What about a recurring motif in your collection, which I'm not sure if we've mentioned it. It's called October Nights, and it's out on October the 22nd. So
Yes.
a good time for Halloween. But you have the Chevrolet Monte Carlo 1977 cropping up. What's the fascination with that? I mean, that's the one that sort of was popular for when low riders were popular.
Yeah. So this is probably a little bit of my Stephen King influence. How many Stephen King movies or short stories or novels are centered around cars, right? Like some of my favorite Stephen King stories and movies, especially movies like Sometimes They Come Back or Riding the Bullet. Of course, there's Carrie, but from a Buick. And I had that car be several different things, and they weren't originally all linked, but slowly I started working toward it. I just remember I had my ex-fiance, her father had a restored 1977 Monte Carlo, black tinted windows, and it was a nice looking car. But I always thought there was something rather predatory about it. Just the way it was low slung to the ground, and the front of it, and with the tinted windows. So in the process of writing and kind of trying to come up with this car that's always driving around, and that just ended up morphing into that, and I just really loved the look of it. And also, I don't think, like, I've read a lot of stories that have those mysterious cars, and I just felt that model wasn't a model. Like you said, Stephen King's always doing the muscle cars from the 50s and things like that. And I've seen a lot of authors copy that. And it just seemed to be like, I don't think I've ever read any cars with a threatening 1977 Monte Carlo before. So that combined with the memory of my ex-fiance's restored, that's kind of where that came from.
That's brilliant. You mentioned earlier that you talk to your students about Stephen King books and also Something Wicked This Way Comes. What's then? Are you a lecturer, a teacher?
Yeah, I teach high school English and literature.
Right.
Yeah. So, and I teach obviously all kinds of literature, but when it comes to October, I always do, well, let's talk about the history of the horror genre, and, let's read some Bradbury, let's read some King, let's read some Shirley Jackson. And it's always a fun unit to do with the kids, because most kids, their knowledge of horror doesn't go past the cinema, And while there are some great works of horror, and I'll be the first person to admit, though, I love sitting down and watching a really bad, cheesy, horror flick. But when I tell them, I said, the horror genre has got literary foundations just like any other genre, but for some reason, I'm not slamming Hollywood and I'm not slamming horror movies, because I'll be the first to admit that I love them. But for some reason, what Hollywood and what horror movies has done to the horror genre is made it seem like it doesn't have a literary background. And I'm like, it may be one of the oldest form of stories that we have. So I always like to do that unit every year around October.
And in one of your stories, the character spends a lot of his spare time watching horror videos on Netflix or down streaming services. Is that you secretly there? Is that what you spend your time doing?
So that story. That story is called the Last Will and Testament of the Not So Good Reverend Ford. It's about a pastor who was disgraced and kind of fleeing bad memories, and unfortunately his flight takes him to Clifton Heights, which doesn't work out so well for him. That was a very experimental story. That actually happened by accident. That found its way into October Nights because another story was just not clicking when I was doing this collection. Again, around April last year, For some, now I'll be the first person to admit, again, I really miss the age of Blockbuster. I miss the rental stores. I've got great memories of Friday night date nights with my wife was go to Blockbuster and try to find a random video. But the nice thing about streaming is there's a lot of access to movies that I never would have ever seen otherwise. But I found myself bouncing back and forth between Shudder and Tubi, and just watching these incredibly like 80s. Some of them were good, some of them were classics I'd never seen before, but some of them were incredibly cheesy 80 horror movies. And I for some reason, after a while, after every single movie, I started picking elements from the movie to focus on, and started imagining a person like this is in its earliest form. I hadn't had the framework yet of the pastor running away. I just had this thought in mind of a guy who was really into horror, and for some reason was watching all these horror movies and focusing on certain. And what happened is I was letting the horror movies that I was watching sort of guide the story, which was tricky in the editing process, because what I found is that there's a limit to what you can say about certain movies in fiction, depending on whether or not they're public use.
Yes.
If they reverted to public domain, you could give the whole plot if you want to.
Yeah.
If they're not reverted to public domain, you have to be careful not to give away spoilers and things like that. So when I went to editing, I did have to cut a lot out, because my publisher was like, well, we can't use this, can't use that. And I didn't necessarily copy the plots of the story, but I very quickly came up with this idea of a guy who was really struggling with his identity, and he was struggling with some pretty big existential questions. And I was surprised when you flip the switch in your brain. I'd be watching this cheesy, low-budget movie. I think there's this one cheesy, low-budget movie I was watching called Berserker I had never heard of before. And yet I'm pulling out all these salient themes that are like, this is the cheesiest movie ever. But in this plot arc I'm developing, it became very experimental, and I think it turned out well. But that was an intentional, like, I was for weeks I'd watch this cheesy movie, and I had this little notebook, and I would just scroll down some notes. And when the other story in the collection didn't work out, I'm like, this could all be leading up to Halloween. This would be a great story. So then I recast it and rewrote some things, and it became part of the collection.
Yeah.
And I love watching horror movies, and I love streaming cheesy horror movies. So there's always a lot of me in my work, but that was definitely a lot of me.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Yeah, we're coming up to Halloween. What would be your top 5 Halloween horror movies, looking at ones that perhaps aren't so well known, getting away from Michael Myers and things like that?
Oh, okay. So some of these are probably well known, but again, not the Michael Myers. First of all, Pumpkinhead with Lance Henriksen is awesome.
Yeah.
Love Pumpkinhead with Lance Henriksen. Dark Knight of the Scarecrow is another great one. Really, really dark, not like Dark Knight of the Scarecrow. There is an anthology film called Trick or Treat. Trick or Treat.
Yeah.
They came. The story behind it's really interesting. For some reason, it came out late. It got distributed late. And there's some great, it's a great, Anna Paquin's in it, a bunch of other people in it. That's a really, really great one. It's a Trick or Treat. Another one would be Tales of Halloween. It's a slightly lower budget. It's also an anthology film. I thought it was I really enjoyed that one as well. And for my last one, the one that I always like to go to every Halloween, what did I just recently? Hack-O-Lantern. If you're looking for the cheesiest low budget movie possible, where that's like it's got this. It's funny too, because one of the main antagonists is apparently made an entire career of being this B movie villain. And if you want to, he just chews the scenery like there's no tomorrow. And it's I don't know, it's just glorious in its hideousness. Hack-O-Lantern. So those are my 5 Halloween movie picks.
Which was number 2, the one after Pumpkinhead?
Trick or Treat. Trick or Treat.
Tales of Halloween, Hack-O-Lantern. I've got one missing. I was just writing them down.
Dark Night of the Scarecrow.
Dark Night of the Scarecrow.
It's just phenomenal. It's a made-for-TV movie, and yet I find myself watching that every year.
What got you into writing, and writing horror in particular?
As far as writing, I think I always wanted to be a writer. I mean, it was it grew out of my love of reading. You know, I just read everything growing up. You know, always had a book in my pocket, and you know, I can remember. I think what sparked it for me was a very simple thing. You know, in I think 8th grade. You know, I was 13, 14 years old, and I read a book and finished it, liked it. The story seemed to be unfinished. Of course, back then there was no Amazon. There's no way of checking to see if there was a sequel.
Mm-hmm.
All I could do was ask the high school librarian, and, you know, and she had no information really. And I thought, well, somebody should write the sequel. I'm like, I should write the sequel. So here I am trying to pet. My first novel was written in a spiral notebook. And it was like a young adult sports adventure. You know, I mean, all I did was play sports growing up, so I was basically trying to write what I knew. But I would play around a lot with, like, you know, I think I was writing Star Wars fan fiction before fan fiction was even a thing.
Yes.
You know, because back then, again, when I was in high school, there were no other Star Wars novels. There was the movie novelizations, there was the 3 Han Solo novels, and the 1 novel by Alan Dean Foster. The Timothy Zahn novels hadn't come out yet, so I was thinking, I'm going to write a Star Wars novel, and that's I've always wanted to be a writer. And I think I initially wanted to be a science fiction writer, especially when I discovered Isaac Asimov in the Foundation series. You know, and I've never revisited those novels. I'm a little afraid to, because I don't know if, like, you know, something you really loved as a kid and then you go back to it and be like, oh, this is so great. But I just loved the scope of the Foundation novels and the robot novels. So I wanted to be a sci-fi writer. And I completed a couple of science fiction manuscripts and even sent a couple off. This is back when Tor Books and Rock Books still had, you know, you could still send them unsolicited manuscripts. And they got rejected. They got rejected, as they should have, you know. But what slowly started turning me to horror was 2 things. First of all, it was a general realization that my science fiction sounded a lot like Star Wars and Star Trek novels. They didn't really, you know, they didn't really have a good science element to them. And there are very few people, Bradbury being one of them, who could write science fiction but have it just be about human beings. You know?
Yes.
The sci-fi market was very much sci-fi, military sci-fi, deep space exploration. I didn't really have a head for that stuff.
Yes.
The second involves an anecdotal story that really started turning my mind toward horror. And of course, during the same period I read The Stand and I read Desperation by Stephen King, and that was that really kind of, both those novels kind of busted my preconceptions of horror up, because they were such deep philosophical novels. So my friends and I every summer used to go to, my friend his grandmother had a cabin on the lake, and we'd go out to the cabin. And one summer we were out there, and we would boat on the lake and things like that. And one summer, my one friend goes, well, we should take Kevin up to the Devil House. And I'm like, what's the Devil House? What is this? You know, we're 20s, or mid-20s. And he's like, it's this old abandoned farmhouse out in the middle of a field. You know, his kids just go in there and write graffiti on it. Now, I always like to tell people that you can tell that I was not a horror fan at this time. Yeah. Because if I was a horror fan and I heard abandoned farmhouse in the middle of a cornfield, I would have been like, no, thank you. I wasn't a horror fan. I didn't know any difference. So when we went out there, to make a long story short, we went out there several times, and we discovered recurring occultic things out there, like pentagrams and like really detailed Like this was above, because I grew up in the 80s and the 90s when painting 666 everywhere was the thing to do. This was above kids painting 666 on the walls. So we would go there and then come back and find things moved around, and it became very clear that people were doing things in this house. And after a while, we're like, we better stay away from this. So there's some stuff going on here that we should be involved in. But for me as a writer, here I was writing a lot of adventure sci-fi that involved aliens and things like that, alien threats from different planets. And here we were, ironically enough, this was in a picturesque Americana small town. So this is also probably, and here the wheels in my head started turning. I'm like, this is Cooperstown, New York. It's got the Baseball Hall of Fame, for goodness sakes. It's this all-American little town. And here's somebody in this all-American little town has got some pretty interesting / strange pastimes. And that really started turning me toward, that's what really turned me to horror, is the idea that there's, who cares really about aliens from another planet? There's lots of threatening stuff here going on in the darkness and the shadows. And also, too, I was going through a darker period of my life. I broke up with my fiance. I was not doing well personally. And science fiction was no longer answering the questions that I was asking about life. And horror was, or at least if horror wasn't asking those questions, horror was directly or indirectly addressing those questions. And that's what drew me to writing it and reading it.
I'd just say, for the benefit of listeners, that you've got your video on and you seem to be in a very interesting room. I can see all manner of things in the background. Are you running a collectibles business down there, or what?
Well, so what we've dubbed this is the Horror Cave. I used to do all my writing in this little square workshop. Well, it used to be a workshop when we moved in, but I don't really use tools. My tools are a pen and paper and a keyboard.
Yeah.
But so I converted it to my office. But we had this spare room down here that it was one of those things we tried to use it for several different things, and it never quite worked out. And so it just became kind of a catch-all room. And I gotta show you a little bit here behind me.
Yeah.
Well, I had a combination of a confluence of things where I had a friend who came to me, a fellow horror writer, who said, well, I want to start a YouTube show where you just start talking about horror. And we're trying to figure out a place to shoot. And then I'm like, well, I want to have a place where I start inviting my friends over to watch horror movies with me. And then this area also has a separate entrance, which is kind of nice, because my wife's not averse to having people over, but we don't have a very big house, and if they come through that. So this has a separate side entrance. So I asked my wife, I said, can I remake that into like a office / place where I keep all my stuff / a filming studio for our YouTube channel, which nobody watches, but that's okay. But she said yes. So what I did is I just redecorated down here. I painted, I built some bookshelves, which kind of surprised me because I'm not very handy. And basically what it is wall-to-wall horror novels. I do have collectibles and posters and things down here, but it's mostly stuff that you'd buy at like Spirit Halloween or thrift stores. They don't really have anything truly valuable. But yeah, so this has become kind of my creation space, my office space. I don't know if I can do this, but I sit right before. Oh, that's not working. Different camera. That thing's not working. I sit right before this gigantic inset bookshelf that I built, so I can always look up and see my Robert McCammon novels or my James Herbert novels, or all my novels here right here. So this is where I write. This is where we film our YouTube show. This is where I have my friends over once a month to watch horror movies. So we've dubbed it the Horror Cave. So
the Horror Cave. Well, that sounds sensible. What is the name of your YouTube channel? We may as well give it a mention.
It's called Into the Abyss.
Into the Abyss. Yep.
Yeah, and we've got about 153 subscribers. I mean, it really isn't. It was really mostly, like I said, it was a conflict. Basically, it's two friends of mine. One is a fellow writer, fellow horror writer. The other one is one of my fellow teachers who just happens to be a horror fan. And we basically it's an excuse to get together once a month to eat and drink and talk about horror. And we just happen to film it. You know, I mean, we do have a schedule, and we do have a loose format that we follow. And we've taped it and then posted it on YouTube. We've done a couple live YouTube things. And we've only been doing it for 2 years. And from what I understand, that if you're going to make a go at YouTube, you need to buckle in and hope that 10 years down the road, maybe you've got a following.
Yeah.
But I think it's mostly we just do it to enjoy ourselves and talk about horror. You know, we're really not concerned with ever getting enough views to monetize it or anything like that. It's just basically us having fun. And, you know, if it ever catches on, great. And if it doesn't catch on, then we're just getting together once a month and drinking and eating and talking about horror. So
that's a plan. Sounds good. Yeah. For somebody who wants to get into more modern horror as opposed to classics like Frankenstein and Dracula and the things like that. We've mentioned Ray Bradbury, we've mentioned Stephen King. Who would be other people you'd have on your list?
Well, if we're talking modern horror from, let's say, 70s through the 90s, Ramsey Campbell is a huge one. James Herbert, Charles L. Grant, and T.M. Wright, unfortunately, are very underread. You know, they were early practitioners of what's called quiet horror, and they're both wonderful writers. Robert McCammon, absolutely, although Robert McCammon has become more than just a horror writer now, just like Stephen King. You know, I'm basically looking at my shelves here and looking at things that I can recommend. I would definitely recommend Gary Braunbeck. You know, Gary A. Braunbeck, he's a great writer. I stumbled over a relatively unknown writer named A.R. Moreland, and she only wrote 2 novels, and she has a big collection, but they also all take place in like a little town. So I really liked her work. Tom Piccarelli, of course. If we're talking more modern, like current contemporary writers right now, my go-to list is always Mary San Giovanni, Ronald Malfi, Norman Prentice, Bracken McLeod, Bob Ford, you know, Rio Yours. These are like kind of the new guard. Those are my go-tos whenever I'm thinking they got a new novel out, then that's going to be an automatic buy for me.
Yeah. You've got your October Nights coming out in 3 weeks' time. 3 weeks' time from about where we're recording this show. What other projects have you got in mind? Because I know most writers, once they've got one book out, they're already working on the next one or the next ideas. What are you looking at?
So I typically always have lots of irons in the fire. I just completed my first gig as an editor. You know, I've always wanted to edit anthologies. I wanted to make myself known as a writer first, because I've seen a lot of friends get involved in editing anthologies, and that kind of ends up taking over. You know, but my first anthology, called Liminal Spaces, will be coming out soon from Cemetery Gates Media. And it's the idea. I kind of wanted to bring back the idea of just an open-ended, speculative anthology around a very loose theme, like Charles Grant's Shadows. You know, where here's a very loose theme and interpret it as you will. And it's got people like Gwendolyn Kiss and Christy DeMeester, and Todd Keisling and Bob Ford, and there's some other awesome, great writers in there, Norman Prentice. And I just finished editing it up. That was a really good experience. It was really enjoyable collecting these stories and reading them. We're hoping that it will do well enough to become a recurring series, and that'll be coming out later fall, I believe. Mm-hmm. Of course, working on a novel now. It's gone through many. It was originally called The Mask. Then it was called The Mask of Sam Hain. Then I'm toying with just calling it the town, calling it the name of the town it takes place in, St. Mary's Kill. It's another Halloween novel, but it's a little bit of a departure to me because I'm just trying to write a creature feature slasher thriller. Trying to write a fun version, of those 80s and 90s movies. And the other thing that I'm going to be getting back to eventually is I have a weird Western that I've spent nearly 10 years on. I have a weird Western involving Billy the Kid and the Regulators fighting monsters. And it's gone through multiple drafts, multiple beta readers. It stands roughly at 90K. And we're at the point now where we're going to polish it off one last time and try to find an agent for that, because I'm very happy working in the small press. And if I never advance further than the small press, I'll, be very content with that. But the novel took so much research and it's such a big scope and it's part of the series. It's not the type I want to at least try to find an agent for it. Mm-hmm. The amount of work that went into it, I don't want to just send it off to a small press. So
yeah. What sort of monsters, without giving any games away, are we talking?
Something ravenous and bestial that replicates.
Right. Okay.
So they're kind of eventually facing a tidal wave of monsters by the end of the book.
Right. I don't think there's much out in that subgenre, is there? I mean, there was that attempt, Daniel Craig, with that cowboys and aliens type thing a few years ago.
Yeah. Not movie-wise. Fiction-wise, weird Westerns. There are some that have been written recently. I think it's a field that I think is ripe for the picking. But really, it was just nothing. It wasn't anything I'd ever considered until probably around 10 years ago. I read a short story. I can't remember the name of it now. I read a short story by Robert E. Howard that just begins. It just begins as a shootout between these two feuding families, and it looks like a straight Western. And then this guy, in trying to escape, stumbles into this subterranean cavern and encounters these like Lovecraftian cosmic monsters. And I just loved the meshing of the two. Where it looks like we're just in a regular shootout, and also too, you're in the middle of a desert and stumbling into a cavern in these unknown regions. Who knows the things that are down there. So I love the concept after I read that story. So
yeah, no, I can see that. Right. Well, Kevin, it's been a delight talking to you. Thank you. Thank you ever so much for your time. Best of luck when the book comes out.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Once again, a big thank you to this week's guest, Kevin Lucia. You can find his blog at kevinlucia.blogspot.com. But as ever, there'll be links on the urbanfantasist.com website, as well as in the podcast and YouTube metadata. And stay tuned, because as this week's interview was shorter than usual, there's still plenty more to come in this week's Weird Tales radio show.
Hey guys, news! The title is Shuckland, and it's a brand new book by Charles Christian. It takes you on a journey through the weird wonders and intriguing mysteries of the Waveney Valley. Explore with Charles the truth behind the notorious Black Shuck of the book's title. Be transported to a world of demonic entities, murderous earls, ley lines, witchcraft, paganism, and discover the facts behind the outrageous legends and folklore of this seemingly peaceful corner of England. Shuckland is a 200-page illustrated paperback available through bookshops and online via Amazon and Books, etc. as well as the Urban Fantasist website at www.urbanfantasist.com. Shuckland is priced at $12.95, and there's an ebook version available on Amazon priced just £3.25. Shuckland, get yours today.
Keeping with the topic of folklore, we're at that point of the year associated with Michaelmas Day. Technically, it's the 29th of September, but a lot of the traditions and superstitions still focus on Old Michaelmas Day, which was the 10th of October. The discrepancy is all due to that pesky calendar change in the mid-18th century, when the UK and what were then still the North American colonies switched from the old-style Julian calendar to the newer Gregorian calendar. Two food-related traditions are associated with Michaelmas. The first involves blackberries or brambles, depending on where you live. In British folklore, Old Michaelmas Day is the last day that blackberries should be picked. It's said that on this day, when Lucifer was expelled from heaven by St. Michael, he fell from the sky straight onto a blackberry bush. He then cursed the fruit, scorched them with his fiery breath, spat and stamped on them, and made them unfit for consumption. Variations of it including that he wipes his club or his tail over them, and another version, certainly one I grew up, was that he or witches piss on them. And the version I was told as a kid up in Yorkshire was never pick blackberries once September is out. Anyway, avoid blackberries after Michaelmas Day. However, on a more positive note, another feature of a Michaelmas Day is eating geese or eating a goose. In fact, the tradition of the Michaelmas goose goes back longer than eggs at Easter and turkey at Christmas. And there's a little saying from East Anglia in 1830. If you don't baste the goose on Michaelmas Day, you'll want money all of the year. In other words, if you don't eat goose on Michaelmas Day, it's bad luck and you'll be poor. And even the celebrated author Jane Austen appears to have been aware of this superstition when she wrote to her sister in 1813, saying, this was just after Michaelmas Day, I dined upon goose yesterday, which I hope will secure a good sale of my second edition. There's never been a satisfactory explanation for the goose eating tradition, although obviously geese are at their prime at this time of the year. However, there is one widespread but completely untrue historical story that says it's our patriotic, that's people in England, duty to do so. It said that Queen Elizabeth I was eating goose on Michaelmas Day when she received news that the Spanish Armada had been defeated, and declared that henceforth all true English people should eat the same on that day in thanks and remembrance for our national delivery. It's a great story, except it was already in circulation about 100 years before this incident. And of course, any mention of geese raises the question of Mother Goose. And this is a bit more debunking. Who was Mother Goose? There is a persistent legend in Boston, Massachusetts, that Mother Goose was based on a person who lived in the city in the early 18th century. Her name was given as Elizabeth Goose, or Vergoose, or even Verboose. And she is said to have sung the old nursery rhymes to her little grandson, whose father copied them down and published them as songs for the nursery or Mother Goose's melodies. And it's said the lady is interred in the old granary burying ground just off Washington Street near Brimstone Corner. Sadly, it's not true, because There was a book that came out long before the Boston Mother Goose was active, and it was by Charles Perrault, a Frenchman, who wrote a lot of um, familiar fairy tales and nursery rhymes, including Puss in Boots, Cinderella, Red Riding Hood, and so on. And he appears to have been the first one that came up with a mother goose. So still a mystery, and no real obvious reason why a mother goose is associated with nursery rhymes and fairy tales. But anyway, eat goose, don't eat blackberries. I'm not sure what you'd do if you're vegetarian or vegan. One of the guests we have coming up on the show in the coming weeks is the writer and illustrator Fez Inkwright, who'll be here talking about, among other things, her latest book, Botanical Curses and Poisons, subtitle The Shadow Lives of Plants. This is what she has to say about foxgloves. Common across the northern hemisphere, foxgloves are particularly distinctive in summer with their tall bell-shaped flowers that can grow up to 5 feet in height, raising them well above most other wild flowers. Though wild foxgloves are typically purple in color, varieties have been cultivated in pink, white, red, and cream. There's also a black dye that can be made from the leaves, and in Wales this colorant is used to paint lines and crosses on stone cottage floors to keep witches away. The one thing more abundant than the flowers on its stalks are the number of folk names and legends that it has gathered. In keeping with its English name, many of them relate back to foxes or gloves, but more often they revolve around fairies, as many plants with bell-shaped flowers do. One Norwegian legend tells how a fairy taught foxes to ring the bells of the foxglove to warn each other of nearby hunters. As previously mentioned, foxgloves have become closely associated with fairies. The fair folk were said to live within the bells, and when fairies would pass the flowers would bow their heads in respect, another trait shared with similar shaped flowers such as the bluebell. The foxglove also plays a part in ridding a family of a suspected changeling. This is a common myth in Europe that changelings are said to be fairy children who have been switched out with real human babies. The fear of changelings was very real and led to many cases of murder and infanticide of supposed fairy usurpers, and likely came from early medieval concerns over children born with disabilities and diseases. Whatever the reason for a child being suspected of being a changeling, there are a number of suggestions of how to force the fairies to return the original baby. One supposed method involved bathing the child in the juice of the foxglove plant, or to leave a piece of the plant beneath the child's bed. A more elaborate cure, which seems to have come from Ireland, is to squeeze the juice out of a foxglove and to give the child 3 drops on the tongue and 3 in each ear. Then place it, that's the suspected changeling, at the door of the house on a shovel and swing it out of the door on the shovel 3 times, saying, "If you're a fairy, be away with you. If it's a fairy child, it will die that night, but if not, it will surely get better." If this remedy was followed, the chances are the child would have died more likely than it would have recovered. This is because foxgloves contain digitoxin, a poison that impedes blood circulation and slows the heart until it stops altogether. This, incidentally, was a common cause of death by accidental poisoning. In Times Telescope in 1822, an article discussed a rising fashion in Derbyshire, England, of poor women drinking foxglove tea as a cheap means of intoxication, as it produces a great exhilaration of spirits and some singular effects on the system. That's a quote. The amount of digitoxin in the stems is so acute that the death can even come from accidentally drinking the water in which foxgloves have stood. So there you go. Don't drink empty flower vase water. This level of toxicity has given the folk name Dead Man's Bells. But it's not entirely without its merits. Digitoxin is still used in modern medicine to treat heart conditions and historically was used to treat aconite poisoning and for a while epilepsy. But those who received a large and repeated doses of digitalis would commonly find their eyesight affected, as the chemical also targets the enzymes in the retina of the eye. This leads to a condition called xanaphosia, which causes a general haziness and a yellow tint to the vision, as well as yellow spots surrounded by coronas. It's even been speculated that Van Gogh's epileptic seizures may have been treated with digitalis, and this may have caused the yellow heavy paintings he created in his later years, and the swirling sky in his famous Starry Night. It's also alluded to in his painting A Portrait of Dr. Cachet, where he depicts the doctor holding the stem of foxglove flowers. The use of foxglove in folk medicine required a steady hand and a broad knowledge of its dangers, but it was a preferred plant of Janet Miller, a healer from the Scottish village of Dunredden, and her knowledge was so much in demand that she travelled extensively in her parish to see patients. With her fame came accusations of witchcraft, and she was eventually tried and executed in Dumfries in 1658. Which neatly brings us back to the Welsh using foxglove dye to mark their floors to keep away witches. Anyway, we'll have Fez Inkwright on the show very shortly. Time for a bit of urban myth busting now as we head up to Scotland to Roslin Chapel, which is in Midlothian, not far from Edinburgh. Now, thanks to Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code novels and the even earlier Holy Blood and Holy Grail books and television series featuring the late Henry Lincoln, Roslin Chapel has become the centre of Knights Templar and Freemasonry conspiracy theories, including suggestion that the chapel is the location of the lost treasures of the Templars and even the hiding place of the Holy Grail. True or false? Well, false probably, as the chapel was built about 150 years after the Knights Templars order had been destroyed and about 300 years before Scottish Freemasonry emerged. As for the Sinclair family, who had the chapel built, far from them being, as legend has it, hereditary Grand Masters of the Knights Templars, they actually gave evidence against the Templars when its members were put on trial in Edinburgh in 1309. There's also no truth in the story that the layout of Roslin Chapel mirrors that of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. They actually look nothing like each other, although the floor plan of Roslin Chapel does almost exactly replicate the floor plan of nearby East Choir at Glasgow Cathedral. And yes, you can today see some Masonic imagery in some of the carvings, but these date back only until the 1860s when the by then near derelict chapel was restored by Edinburgh architect and well-known Freemason David Bryce. But what, you say, about the elaborately carved prentice or apprentice pillar, which is the focus of some equally elaborate legends and theory? The story is the master mason responsible for much of the interior chapel was struggling with the design of this particular pillar, and that while he was away seeking inspiration, his apprentice completed the job himself, creating a pillar that was so beautiful that in a fit of jealous rage, his master killed his apprentice by hitting him over the head with a stonemason's mallet. Not only does this echo the Masonic legend of Hiram Abiff, who helped build Solomon's Temple and was also murdered, and also the fact that in Freemasonry there's a lot of symbolism surrounding the Boaz and Jachin pillars, but it is also reinforced by some of the other carvings that could be seen in Roslin Chapel, including apparently the face of the apprentice, complete with the fatal gash on his forehead, who can be seen high up on one wall, and another face said to be that of his master shortly before he was to be hanged for his crime, which is high up on another wall. Well, not only are there no records of any such murders taking place during the construction of Roslin Chapel, but until as recently as 1778, the pillar was known as the Prince's Pillar, not the Prentice's Pillar. And it's thought that it was really a slight slip of the tongue that somehow princes moved into prentices. In fact, according to an article that appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine in September 1817, and you can't say we don't do our homework here on Weird Tales, the whole Prentice Pillar story was made up by, and I quote, a venerable crone called Annie Wilson, who for about 20 years gave conducted tours around the chapel and realized that the taller the tale she told, the bigger the tips she received. So, Roslin Chapel and its legends. A fantasy story started by Annie Wilson in 1800 and completed 200 years later by Dan Brown. One final item before we go. Archaeologists excavating and researching the buried ruins of the Bronze Age city of Tal el Haman in the Jordan Valley, near the Dead Sea, have found evidence to suggest the city was destroyed by a Tunguska-sized airburst about 3,600 years ago. Tunguska in 1908 saw an estimated 22 megaton airburst caused by a comet or meteorite exploding in the Earth's atmosphere. To give it some sense of scale, that's about 1,000 times the destructive power of the atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima in World War II. What intrigues the archaeologists is the biblical book of Genesis' description of the destruction of the city of Sodom could actually be based on a garbled account of the destruction of Tel el Haman. And it might even explain why the walls fell down at the nearby city of Jericho. So, blame it on a cosmic airburst. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you so much for listening in. Please join me again next week for more strange tales for strange times. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, folklore, and the paranormal. You can keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com,